Story number 1.
The streets were deserted, as they always were at this time of night. I had been walking home from a late shift at the diner, the kind of job that made the nights drag on endlessly. The air was crisp and sharp, the smell of wet asphalt lingering from the rain earlier in the evening. I wasn't a stranger to walking alone at night. In fact, I preferred it. The city felt different when the hustle and bustle faded into the background. It was quieter, more peaceful. But tonight was different. I could feel it, a heaviness that hung in the air, like the calm before a storm. My apartment wasn't far, just a few blocks away, but the route I took was through a stretch of quiet, mostly residential streets, the kind of place where streetlights seemed too far apart, leaving dark pockets in between, where the shadows stretched long and threatening. I walked at a steady pace, trying to shake the sense of unease creeping up my spine. It wasn't the kind of fear that comes from thinking someone's following you or a vague sense of danger. It was the kind of fear that seeps into your bones for no reason at all, a nagging discomfort that something wasn't quite right. I had just passed the old church on the corner when I heard it, a faint sound, barely audible over the distant hum of the city. It was like the soft scrape of shoes on concrete, almost too quiet to register. I glanced over my shoulder instinctively, but there was no one behind me. I shrugged it off, blaming the wind or my tired mind playing tricks on me. Still, the feeling wouldn't leave. It lingered, cold and insistent. The streets ahead were still empty, the houses silent. The only sounds now were the occasional rustle of leaves, the wind picking up in spurts. But then there it was again. A sound, closer this time. I turned, my heart starting to race, but still, nothing, no one. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Get it together," I muttered under my breath. There was no reason to be scared. It was just a quiet night. But as I continued walking, the feeling that I wasn't alone intensified. The sound came again, this time clearer. Someone was walking behind me. I spun around, my pulse quickening. I saw nothing but the empty sidewalk stretching out behind me, the faint glow of a streetlight casting long shadows. My breath hitched in my throat. I couldn't see anyone, but the footsteps were unmistakable. I started walking faster, the sound of my shoes tapping against the pavement suddenly loud and jarring in my ears. I glanced behind me again, expecting to see someone, a passerby, maybe a jogger, but there was no one there, just the empty street and the shadows. The footsteps didn't stop. I broke into a brisk walk, nearly into a jog. My heart was pounding now, the fear crawling up my neck. I glanced over my shoulder one last time, my mind screaming that someone was behind me, but still, there was nothing. That's when I heard it, a voice. Soft, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. "Don't run." I froze. It came from behind me, from the darkened street I had just passed. A voice so calm, so eerily quiet, it sent chills down my spine. The voice was so close, I could almost feel the breath on the back of my neck. My skin prickled with terror, and I stood frozen, rooted to the spot. I turned slowly, my heart racing. There, standing at the edge of the dim streetlight, was a figure. It was tall, draped in a long coat that seemed to blend into the night. The face was obscured, hidden in shadow. I couldn't make out any details, only the silhouette, the outline of a person standing there watching me. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The figure didn't move either, but I could feel its presence, as if it was waiting for something. Waiting for me. "Who are you?" I managed to croak, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't answer. It didn't even make a sound, but I could feel it watching me, its eyes burning into the back of my skull. I took a shaky step back, my legs like lead, and that's when the voice came again, this time louder, clearer. "Don't run." I could barely hear my own heartbeat over the pounding in my ears. The terror was overwhelming, suffocating. I wasn't sure what I was more afraid of, the figure itself or the voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My feet were frozen in place, as if some invisible force was holding me there, preventing me from moving. The figure slowly raised a hand, and I felt a sharp, sudden chill in the air. A gust of wind swept past me, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, something old, something forgotten. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the figure take a step toward me, its movements slow, deliberate. "Please," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Just leave me alone." But the figure didn't stop. It moved closer, its long coat billowing out behind it, and I could feel the temperature drop even further, a coldness that was unnatural, as though the very air around me had been sucked into the darkness. My mind screamed at me to run, to escape, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed with fear, trapped in some kind of unspoken standoff between me and this presence that seemed both familiar and terrifyingly foreign at the same time. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the figure stopped. It was mere feet away now, close enough for me to see the outline of its face, still hidden in shadow, but unmistakably there. For a long moment, we stood like that, separated by a mere breath, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure turned and began walking away. Slowly, deliberately, disappearing into the darkness, leaving nothing behind but the echo of its steps and the strange, hollow silence that followed. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, unable to move, my heart still racing in my chest. But as the last of the figure's footsteps faded into the night, I found myself able to breathe again. My legs, still shaky, carried me forward, and I walked faster now, not looking back. I could still hear that voice in my head, a soft whisper that seemed to linger in the air. Don't run. I made it to my apartment building without looking back once, my hands trembling as I fumbled with my keys. When I finally got inside, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, gasping for air. The room was silent, the only sound the steady thrum of my heartbeat. I didn't know if I had imagined it all or if the figure had truly been there, but the fear didn't leave me. Not that night and not for a long time after. Story the end.
Story number 2.
It was the beginning of November when I made the decision to walk home late from my shift at the diner. I'd worked the late shift, and by the time I left, it was past midnight. The streets were quiet, and the usual bustle of the town had long since quieted. I wasn't afraid of walking alone at night. I'd done it before countless times. But tonight, something felt different. There was a certain heaviness in the air, like the night was pressing down on me. I worked in a small town, a place where everyone knew each other, and the streets were typically empty after dark. The walk home was a familiar one, down Main Street, past the old church, and then through the quieter residential streets that led to my apartment. A 30-minute walk if I didn't dawdle, and the streetlights along the way provided just enough illumination to feel secure. But tonight, the air was unnaturally cold for November, and the streetlights flickered. The rustling of leaves, which was usually calming, had an almost sinister edge. I shook my head, dismissing the unsettling feeling that clung to me. As I passed by the old church, I noticed the gate was slightly ajar. It had been closed earlier in the evening when I passed by, so I assumed it was just the wind, or maybe a forgetful caretaker. But there was something about it, the way it hung there, that made me pause for a moment. My feet stopped on the cracked sidewalk, but after a few seconds I continued my walk, convincing myself it was nothing. It was just a dark night. The path ahead seemed to stretch longer than usual, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, as though expecting someone to be following me. But there was no one, just the quiet hum of distant traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next few blocks were uneventful, the familiar houses passing by like shadows. But then I heard it, a faint sound like footsteps behind me. My stomach dropped. I couldn't be sure if it was real or just my mind playing tricks on me, but I slowed my pace slightly, straining my ears to listen. The footsteps stopped. I forced myself to breathe. Maybe it was just someone out for a late-night walk, or maybe it was the echo of my own footsteps bouncing off the buildings. I picked up my pace again, but as soon as I did, the footsteps started again, closer this time. They were matching my pace as though someone was right behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, but all I saw was the empty sidewalk stretching out behind me, the streetlights casting long shadows on the ground. My breath came faster now, and my heart began to pound in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking more than I intended. No response. I tried to shake the feeling off, telling myself that I was being paranoid. It had to be nothing, but still, the footsteps continued, louder now, just a few feet behind me. I could almost feel the presence, like someone was right there, breathing down my neck. I quickened my pace again, but the footsteps quickened too, keeping in perfect time with my movements. It was like they were mocking me, following me with no intent of stopping. I spun around abruptly, fully expecting to see someone there. But the street was empty. The shadows stretched out in front of me, and the wind blew through the trees, their branches creaking in the stillness. Nothing. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. It was ridiculous. There was no one there. I was just exhausted, stressed from the late shift, my mind playing tricks on me. But as I turned back around to continue my walk, I heard it again, this time much closer, right behind me. It was unmistakable now. Someone was following me. The footsteps were too deliberate, too close to be a coincidence. I broke into a fast walk, my shoes hitting the pavement harder than before. Every step was louder, more frantic. But no matter how fast I walked, the footsteps kept pace with me, always just a little behind. My chest tightened, and I could feel a cold sweat creeping down my spine. "Who's there?" I yelled, the words cutting through the silence of the night. There was no reply, only the sound of the footsteps, and my own breath coming in short, panicked bursts. I couldn't outrun them. It was like they were attached to me, following me no matter what I did. I turned down a side street, hoping to lose whoever, or whatever, was trailing me. But the footsteps followed, unchanged in their pace. My heart was pounding so hard now that I could barely hear anything else. I was no longer rational. I needed to get home. I needed to feel safe. As I reached the corner of my street, I glanced over my shoulder one more time, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the end of the block, barely illuminated by the faint light of the street lamp. It was tall, its outline indistinct, but I could tell it was watching me. I stumbled backward, panic setting in. My hands fumbled for my phone, my fingers numb as I tried to dial 911, but the screen blurred in front of me. My eyes kept darting to the figure. It hadn't moved. I finally managed to call for help, but as I stood there, waiting for the operator to pick up, the figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. The sound of footsteps, my footsteps or something else's, grew louder, almost deafening in the silence of the street. The closer the figure got, the more the air seemed to thicken, like the atmosphere itself was pressing in on me. The operator's voice finally broke through my panic, but it was too late. Before I could speak, before I could explain what was happening, the figure vanished. It wasn't like it disappeared suddenly, like it had turned around or walked away. It just faded, as if the night had swallowed it whole. I stood there in stunned silence, staring at the spot where the figure had been, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The footsteps were gone now, too, and the night was still again. It was like everything had returned to normal. I managed to speak to the 911 operator, though I still wasn't entirely sure what to say. There was no sign of anyone, no trace of whoever or whatever had followed me. The police came by a few minutes later, but by then, everything seemed to be just as it had been before. No figure, no footsteps, no sign of anything strange. But I knew what I felt. And even now, months later, I still can't explain it. It's always in the back of my mind. That feeling of being watched, of hearing those footsteps when no one was there. Now, whenever I walk alone at night, I always find myself looking over my shoulder. I never quite feel alone, not completely. And every time I hear the sound of footsteps behind me, my heart races just a little faster. Story the end.
Story number 3.
It was a cold November evening when I decided to take my usual late night walk. I had just finished a long shift at the bookstore, and the city streets were quieter than usual, with only a few cars driving by and the occasional pedestrian in a hurry to get home. I liked the peace of these hours, the way the world seemed to belong to me, and me alone. My apartment was about a 20-minute walk from the bookstore, down quiet streets lined with old buildings and the occasional tree. The path was familiar, and I had walked it countless times. But tonight, something felt off, like there was a presence in the air, a weight that I couldn't shake. I had always been the kind of person who appreciated the quiet of the night, but tonight I couldn't seem to calm the strange unease creeping up my spine. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a feeling like being watched. But I told myself that it was nothing, a figment of my tired mind, a trick of the quiet darkness. As I walked, my footsteps echoed in the stillness. I passed the old park with its rusted gates and abandoned playground, the swings creaking in the wind. I wasn't afraid of the park. I had walked through it countless times before, even late at night. But tonight, the shadows seemed deeper, darker. I quickened my pace, trying to shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was at that moment that I heard it, the faintest sound, like someone walking behind me. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe my own footsteps echoing back to me. But when I listened more closely, I realized the sound was too deliberate, too consistent. Someone was walking behind me. I turned around, but the street was empty. Nothing but the cold, dim streetlights and the empty sidewalk stretched behind me. No one was there. I paused for a moment, my heart racing. Maybe it was just a trick of the night, I thought. Maybe someone was walking at the same pace, but I hadn't noticed them. I continued on, trying to shake the feeling that I was being followed. But as I walked, the sound continued. Soft, rhythmic footsteps just behind me. My breath hitched in my throat as the steps grew louder, closer. I quickened my pace, but the footsteps matched mine, growing faster as if whatever was behind me was now keeping up. I spun around again, my heart pounding in my chest, but once more the street was empty. The silence was suffocating, the kind of silence that feels too loud. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what was happening. There was no one behind me, no one in sight, but the footsteps, those footsteps, they were real. I could hear them, feel them, as if something or someone was right there with me. My mind raced and panic began to set in. I started walking faster, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The faster I went, the faster the footsteps followed. It was as if they were just behind me, right on my heels, yet when I turned around, there was nothing there. I was almost at the end of the block when I heard a voice, soft and faint, but clear enough that it stopped me in my tracks. "Don't run." I froze. The voice was low, calm, almost soothing, but there was an edge to it, something cold and unnatural that sent a wave of terror through me. I turned slowly, but the street remained empty. No one was there. I could feel my pulse racing, my body tense, but I couldn't move. The voice had come from nowhere. It was as if it was all around me, in the air itself. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling, but there was no answer, just the sound of my own voice breaking the heavy silence. I took a shaky step forward, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps behind me had stopped. The silence felt even more oppressive now, as if the world had stopped moving, waiting for something. I had to get home. I had to get out of here. I started walking again, my pace quickening, my breath coming in shallow bursts, but as I moved, I could feel the presence, like something was following me, just behind me, invisible but there. The air felt colder, the shadows longer. When I reached the next intersection, I stopped at the crosswalk and looked around. There was no one else in sight, not a car, not a soul. But just as I was about to cross the street, I heard the footsteps again. Close. Too close. I spun around, expecting to see someone there, but there was nothing. The street was empty. My eyes darted back and forth, searching for any sign of movement, any clue as to what was happening, but all I saw was the empty street, the flickering streetlights, the shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. I had to get home. I had to get inside where it was safe. I didn't look back as I crossed the street and headed down the block toward my apartment. I walked faster, my footsteps echoing on the pavement, but the sound of footsteps behind me never stopped. It was there, always there, never far enough to feel safe. When I reached the entrance to my building, I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking uncontrollably. The sound of footsteps behind me grew louder, closer, as if whatever was following me had caught up. "Please, please," I whispered under my breath, willing my hands to stop trembling. Finally, I managed to get the door open, and I rushed inside, slamming the door behind me. I leaned against the door, gasping for air, my mind racing. I waited, listening. The sound of footsteps had stopped. The silence in the building was deafening. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that it was just a trick of the mind, that nothing had happened, that I had imagined it all. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. I could still feel it, the presence, the footsteps that followed me, the voice that told me not to run. As I stood there, trying to steady my breath, I heard it again, the same voice, as soft and cold as before. "Don't run." The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. The voice wasn't outside. It was inside the building. I didn't dare look. I didn't want to. but I knew with a sinking feeling in my stomach that whatever had followed me was still here. Story the end.
Story number 4.
I was 22 when I started working late shifts at the downtown bookstore. It wasn't the ideal job, but it paid the bills, and it allowed me to live in the city where I had always wanted to be. My apartment was small and tucked away in a quiet neighborhood far from the hustle of the city, but I liked that. It felt safe. I had always been the type who enjoyed the solitude of the night. Walking home after a late shift gave me time to reflect, to think. The streets were empty, the air crisp and cool. There was something peaceful about it, like the city had paused for a moment, just for me. One particular evening, I worked later than usual. The store had been quiet, with only a few late-night customers browsing the aisles. By the time I locked up, the streets were empty. It was just after midnight. I stepped out of the store, adjusting my bag on my shoulder, and began my usual walk home. The night was colder than it had been all week, and I wrapped my scarf tighter around my neck. The faint hum of streetlights was the only sound as I made my way down the sidewalk. There was no wind, no cars, no people, just me and the quiet of the night. I felt a sense of calm, as I always did, walking alone in the dark. But tonight, something felt different. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. The streets looked the same, the quiet felt the same. But there was this weight in the air, a heaviness I couldn't ignore. My footsteps echoed too loudly on the pavement, too solitary in the stillness. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. I laughed at myself, dismissing the feeling. But as I continued walking, it came again. The feeling of being watched. I stopped, suddenly aware of my own rapid heartbeat. My senses were on high alert, but when I looked around, there was no one in sight. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself, shaking my head. I kept walking, but I couldn't shake the sensation that something was wrong. The quiet streets that I had walked 100 times before now felt ominous. As I passed a street lamp, I noticed it flickering, casting long shadows that danced unnaturally on the sidewalk. I hurried my pace, hoping to get home faster. But that's when I heard it. Footsteps. It was soft at first, almost like a whisper on the wind, but they were there. Someone was walking behind me, mirroring my steps. My pulse quickened. I glanced over my shoulder once more. Nothing. There was no one there. I could see the entire street, lit by the dim streetlights, and there was no one else in sight. My steps quickened. The sound behind me did too. Footsteps. Closer now. I could feel my breath tightening in my chest. I turned the corner onto a side street, hoping to lose whatever it was that was following me, but the footsteps didn't stop. They were right there, just behind me, always a beat behind. Every time I sped up, they did too, maintaining the exact same distance between us. I glanced over my shoulder again, half expecting to see someone, but the street was empty. Only the light from the lamps stretched out in pools on the sidewalk. "Hello?" I called out into the darkness, my voice shaking more than I wanted to admit. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. My heart was pounding in my ears, but I still didn't hear anything. The air felt thicker now, and I could almost taste the tension in it. I was no longer sure of what was real and what wasn't. I kept walking, more quickly now, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then, just as I was passing a long stretch of empty sidewalk, I heard it again. A low, raspy breath, right behind me. I froze, my blood running cold. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't like a normal sound. It was wrong, unnatural. It didn't belong in the night, in the empty streets. It was as if something was right there, standing behind me, breathing on my neck. I turned around so fast I nearly tripped, but there was no one there. I took a few unsteady steps back, my heart hammering in my chest. My eyes darted around the street, but there was nothing. Just the empty sidewalk stretching out before me, the streetlights casting their long shadows. Then I saw it. At the far end of the street, just under the last street lamp, there was a figure. It was standing still facing me, but I couldn't make out any details. It was as if the darkness had swallowed it up, leaving only a shape, a vague outline of a person. It was too far away to tell for sure, but it was there, and it was watching me. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the ground. The figure stood there, unmoving. Then, just as suddenly as I had spotted it, it was gone. Vanished. I didn't even hear it move. One moment it was there, and the next it wasn't. It was as if the figure had never existed. I stood there for a few moments, completely still, my chest rising and falling with every labored breath. I forced myself to take another step, then another, my legs feeling like lead as I stumbled down the street. I had to get home. I had to get out of this dark, empty place. The walk from there to my apartment seemed to take forever. Every shadow seemed darker, every sound more amplified. I didn't stop to look around again, didn't let myself think. I just moved, faster now, until the familiar glow of the streetlights near my building came into view. When I finally reached my door, I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so much I almost dropped them. I got inside, locked the door behind me, and leaned against it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I sat on the couch for a long time, staring at the wall, my heart still racing. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it had been a trick of the mind. Maybe I had imagined the figure. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen, what I'd felt. The air had changed that night, thick with something I couldn't explain. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been following me, something that wasn't human. That night, I left every light in my apartment on and kept the windows closed. I didn't sleep well, and every time I walked home late after that, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't forget the figure, the way it had stood there, watching me. Every night after, the sound of footsteps always echoed in my mind, always just a little behind me. I never walked alone again without feeling that weight in the air, that feeling of being watched, and I never could explain what had happened that night.
Story number 5.
I remember that night as if it were yesterday. The night that made me question everything I thought I knew about reality. It all started when I decided to walk home from work late one evening, something I had done countless times before. My office was a bit out of the way, a few blocks from the main downtown area. My apartment wasn't far, just a quiet residential neighborhood that stretched into the outskirts of town. I liked walking at night. It was peaceful, the streets empty, the world silent except for my thoughts and the occasional car passing by. That evening, the air had a sharp bite to it, signaling that winter was just around the corner. I wrapped my coat tightly around me, my breath forming little clouds in the chill as I walked down the street. The city was unusually quiet that night, the kind of silence that made you feel like you were the only one left in the world. I didn't mind it at first. In fact, I welcomed it. It gave me time to clear my head, to unwind after a long day of work. But that silence, it felt wrong. I didn't pay much attention at first, thinking it was just my nerves or the tiredness settling in. But as I walked down the familiar streets, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness, I began to notice something strange. The shadows seemed longer, deeper. There was something about the way the streetlights flickered, casting an eerie, inconsistent glow on the pavement. It felt like I wasn't alone, but I couldn't put my finger on why. My heart rate picked up, but I told myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on my mind. I passed the old park, usually a bustling area during the day, but now silent, almost abandoned. The swings swayed gently in the wind, creaking with each movement. I paused for a moment, staring at the park's outline in the dim light, a strange unease crawling over me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't fear, exactly, more like a sense of being watched, of something lurking just beyond my field of vision. But I shook my head and kept walking, trying to shake off the feeling. It wasn't until I reached the block just before my apartment that things took a turn. I was nearing a quiet intersection when I heard it. Footsteps. Soft at first, barely audible over the sound of my own steps, but then they grew louder, closer. I glanced behind me. Nothing. The street was empty, just the faint, flickering lights and the quiet hum of the city. I slowed my pace, my heart starting to race. The footsteps were still there, just behind me, moving in perfect rhythm with mine. I stopped walking for a moment, and they stopped too. My breath caught in my throat. I turned around quickly, my eyes scanning the street. There was no one there. I stood still for a moment, listening intently, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no sounds of movement, just silence. My mind told me it was probably just another pedestrian or someone walking at the same pace. But the thought didn't settle my nerves. I started walking again, faster now, my senses heightened, every noise amplified in the quiet night. The footsteps resumed. Closer. Louder. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just someone behind me. Someone behind, maybe they were walking faster, or maybe I was just hearing things. But the more I walked, the more the sound grew, as if whoever was following me was deliberately keeping just enough distance to remain unseen. My pulse quickened, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was following me, and it wasn't human. I turned down a side street, hoping to throw whatever was behind me off course, but the footsteps followed. I picked up my pace, walking as fast as I could without breaking into a full sprint, but they were always there, right behind me. I could almost feel the presence now, something dark and heavy, like it was suffocating the air around me. I reached the last block before my apartment building, my heart pounding in my chest. The street was empty, but I could still hear those footsteps, still feel them closing in. I turned the corner to head toward the entrance of the building, hoping the lights from the lobby would provide some comfort, some sense of safety. But when I reached the front steps, I stopped dead in my tracks. Standing there, right at the entrance of the building, was a figure. It wasn't a person, not in the way I was used to seeing people. It was tall, unnaturally so, its form draped in a long dark coat that seemed to blend with the night itself. I couldn't make out any features, no face, no hands, nothing. Just the outline of something standing perfectly still, just beyond the dim light from the building's entrance. I felt a cold chill wash over me, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. The footsteps stopped. I don't know how long we stood there, me frozen in place, the figure unmoving. But I knew one thing. I had to get inside. I had to get away from whatever that thing was. I took a step forward, slowly, my hand trembling as I reached for the door, but as my hand touched the handle, the figure's head turned toward me, slowly, almost deliberately. It wasn't fast, but it was enough to send a shock of terror through me. The darkness beneath its hood seemed to expand like an empty void, and for a moment I thought I saw something shifting inside it. Something wrong. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. I yanked open the door, slamming it behind me, and rushed into the building. My heart was racing, my breath shallow, my hands slick with sweat as I climbed the stairs to my apartment. When I reached my door, I hurriedly unlocked it, slammed it shut, and bolted the lock behind me. I stood there for a moment, panting, my eyes scanning the empty apartment, the quiet space that had always been my sanctuary. But as I looked around, something felt different. It felt like I wasn't alone. I could feel the presence again, that heavy weight, as if something was waiting just out of sight. My eyes darted to the windows, the darkened view of the street below. The shadows outside seemed deeper, darker than usual, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, watching, waiting. I went to bed that night, but I didn't sleep. Every sound outside, every creak in the building made me jump. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the image of the figure standing at the entrance of my building. I thought I was just being paranoid, but I knew deep down that what I had felt that night was real. I wasn't sure what it was, but I knew it was something otherworldly, something beyond explanation. The footsteps, the figure, the coldness, it all lingered in my mind. And to this day, whenever I walk alone at night, I can't help but feel that same unease, that same feeling of being watched. Story the end.
Story number 6.
It was just another typical Friday night when I found myself walking alone down the familiar empty streets of my neighborhood. I had worked late at the cafe, and the walk home was something I had done countless times before. The air was cool for late September, with a slight breeze that rustled the leaves along the sidewalks. The city lights above me hummed faintly, and the streets were deserted, just the way I liked it. I felt a kind of calm, a solace in the stillness. But that night, something about the walk home unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. The route was simple enough, down a few blocks, past the park, and then left onto the narrow street where I lived. It was a small, quiet neighborhood, the kind where you could walk for hours without crossing paths with anyone. As I walked, I became acutely aware of the stillness around me. Not just the absence of people, but a kind of eerie, suffocating silence that settled in the air. I didn't hear the usual hum of distant traffic or the muffled sound of neighbors talking from their windows. It was unnaturally quiet. The only sound was the rhythmic crunch of my shoes on the gravel and the occasional rustling of leaves. At first, I chalked it up to the late hour. The streets weren't exactly bustling after midnight, especially in this part of town. But the longer I walked, the more something gnawed at me. It wasn't the cold, but a strange sense of unease creeping up my spine. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and picked up my pace, hoping to reach home quickly. That's when I heard it. A soft, deliberate footstep behind me. I paused. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. The noise could have easily been my own footsteps echoing off the empty pavement, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I glanced behind me, half expecting to see someone walking just a few feet away, but the street was as empty as before. There was no one there. Shaking my head, I continued walking, telling myself it was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation that someone was watching me, that familiar feeling of being followed, but when I looked over my shoulder again, there was no one in sight. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone was out there, maybe a late night jogger, or someone taking their dog for a walk. But as I kept walking, I heard it again. This time, it was louder, a distinct, unmistakable step echoing against the pavement just behind me. I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart started pounding in my chest as I stood there, frozen, listening intently. Nothing. The streets were silent once more. I turned around slowly, expecting to see someone there, but the path was still empty. No one. No movement. I started walking again, but now I was aware of every sound, the wind, my own breathing, the click of my shoes on the pavement. I could feel my pulse quickening as I glanced over my shoulder every few seconds, half expecting to see someone there. But there was no one. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I wasn't alone. The chill in the air seemed to grow colder, and the quiet around me felt oppressive. I passed the park, usually a lively spot during the day, but now it was eerily dark and abandoned. The tall trees cast long, crooked shadows across the ground, and the faint sound of rustling leaves seemed to follow me as I walked past. The streetlights flickered once, twice, before they steadied again, casting weak pools of light onto the empty sidewalk. I quickened my pace, but the footsteps were there again, closer now. They were unmistakable, the soft shuffle of feet behind me matching my every step. I stopped once more and spun around. Nothing. I was alone. But I could hear the footsteps. They were still there. I held my breath, listening, and the sound stopped. I stood there, terrified, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The night was still, too still. I turned around again and hurried my pace. I could feel the presence behind me as if someone was following me, just out of sight. My feet moved faster, and with each step, the sound of footsteps behind me grew louder, closer. I glanced over my shoulder again, my heart racing in my chest, but there was no one. The sidewalk stretched on, empty. The streetlights flickered again, casting their cold glow across the pavement. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. I was almost home now, only a few blocks away, but the footsteps behind me didn't stop. They were right there, so close I could almost hear the breath of whoever, or whatever, was following me. I felt it, an oppressive presence just behind me, urging me to walk faster, to run. I broke into a jog, my footsteps now outpacing the mysterious steps behind me. But they still followed, never faltering, matching my speed. The faster I ran, the louder the footsteps became. I could feel the weight of them pressing down on me, pushing me forward, urging me to go faster, as if something was chasing me. The terror in my chest was suffocating, but I didn't dare look back anymore. I just ran. I reached my block, breathless, my legs burning, and I fumbled with my keys as I reached my building. My heart was thumping so loudly I could barely hear anything else. I managed to unlock the door and slammed it behind me as I stepped inside. I locked the door immediately, breathing heavily, trying to calm my racing heart. I stood there for a long moment, listening. The house was quiet, just the sound of my own breathing. The footsteps were gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling. That presence, that feeling of being followed. It lingered in the back of my mind, that a constant whisper in the dark corners of my thoughts. I tried to tell myself it was just paranoia, that I had imagined it, but the way I had felt, like something was right there, just behind me, that weight in the air, I couldn't ignore it. The next morning, I went about my day as usual. I didn't tell anyone about what happened the night before. I figured I had just been overly tired or anxious, that maybe the late shift had messed with my mind. But every time I walked home after dark in the days that followed, I couldn't shake that same feeling. The footsteps always seemed to follow me, even though no one was there. And as the weeks went by, I started to notice something strange. The sensation didn't just happen at night. During the day, when I walked down the street, I would sometimes hear footsteps just behind me, like someone was walking at the same pace. But when I turned around, there was no one there. I began to wonder if something had followed me that night, something that wasn't ready to let me go. I still walk home alone sometimes, but I don't feel the same sense of calm anymore. I can't shake the feeling that something is always with me, even when I can't see it, that I'm never really alone. Story the end.
Story number 7.
I'd always enjoyed walking alone at night. Something about the stillness and the solitude of the streets, far removed from the chaos of the daytime world, brought me a sense of peace. I was used to the quiet hum of the city as it wound down, the distant sound of traffic, the occasional passerby, and the feeling that the city belonged to me and me alone for a few hours. But one particular night, something changed, something that made me question everything I thought I knew about the world around me. It was a chilly autumn evening, the kind of night where the air feels crisp against your skin and the wind carries the scent of damp leaves. I had just finished my shift at the small coffee shop I worked at downtown, and the walk back home was usually a 20-minute jaunt through quiet streets. I liked it that way. My apartment was in a building tucked on the edge of a residential neighborhood, far enough from the noisy streets to feel isolated, but close enough to the main road to be convenient. I pulled my coat tighter around myself, glancing up at the half-full moon hanging low in the sky. It was the sort of evening that felt almost too quiet, like the world had been holding its breath in anticipation of something. But I shrugged off the feeling and kept walking, my footsteps echoing in the empty street. The usual things, the glow of streetlights, the soft rustle of leaves in the wind, did little to ease the creeping sense of unease that had settled over me. The first sign that something was wrong came when I reached the old church at the end of my street. It was a historic building, towering and shadowed, with stained glass windows that flickered with the last remnants of the evening light. It had always been a quiet, peaceful place. I never thought much about it. It was just a part of the landscape. But tonight, as I passed by it, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was no one there. The street was completely empty. I chalked it up to my overactive imagination and picked up my pace, eager to leave that corner of the street behind. As I continued walking, I started hearing something. At first, it was soft, just a faint noise that I could barely make out above the sound of my own footsteps. I paused, listening intently. It was coming from behind me, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. But when I turned around, the street was as empty as it had been moments before. I stood there for a moment, scanning the street, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. After all, it was late, and the wind could have easily made a strange noise. But then the footsteps came again. This time, they were closer. A slow, deliberate rhythm, each step falling just behind me. My pulse quickened. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I wasn't imagining this. Someone was definitely behind me, walking at the same pace I was, but when I turned again, there was no one there. Just the dark, empty street stretching out before me. I started walking faster, my breath coming a little faster now, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps followed. Closer. They were real. Someone was there. I glanced over my shoulder once more, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever or whatever was walking behind me. But still, there was nothing. No one. Just shadows and streetlights and the unnerving feeling that I wasn't alone. The footsteps seemed to be getting louder now, closer, until they were practically in sync with mine. I could feel the pressure building in my chest, a tightness that came from the growing certainty that I was being followed, that someone was waiting to make their move. I broke into a light jog, my feet hitting the pavement faster. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I tried to get away from the feeling. But the footsteps sped up too, matching my pace perfectly. I was running now, and yet they stayed with me, right behind me, never faltering. I could almost hear the sound of their breath, feel the weight of their presence. I turned a corner, hoping to lose them, but the footsteps didn't stop. They followed, round the corner, close enough now that I could almost feel the cold breath of the person behind me, brushing against the back of my neck. I ran faster, fear surging through me, my mind racing with thoughts of what was happening. There was no one there. There couldn't be. And yet, the footsteps were real. I reached the intersection where my building stood, breathless, my body shaking. I had to get inside. I had to make it inside, away from whatever this was. I dashed for the front door, fumbled for my keys, my hands slick with sweat despite the chill in the air. When I finally got the door open, I rushed inside and slammed it shut behind me, locking it quickly. I leaned against the door, gasping for air, my heart still pounding, the adrenaline coursing through me. The apartment building was quiet, still. I could hear the sound of my own breathing, but nothing else. I stood there for a moment, listening. The footsteps had stopped. I made my way up to my apartment on the second floor, still shaken, my thoughts racing. What had just happened? Who had been following me? The silence in the building was suffocating, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I didn't feel safe. Not in my own home. I went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. The shadows in my apartment seemed deeper than usual, as though they were moving, shifting. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to shut out the cold feeling that lingered in the air. But the memory of the footsteps, those footsteps, was still with me, lingering in the dark corners of my mind. I woke up the next morning, the light filtering softly through the blinds, and for a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare. But as I went about my day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that something was different now, like a shift had occurred, something I couldn't quite put into words. The streets felt emptier, quieter somehow, and every time I passed the old church, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, expecting to hear the footsteps again. I haven't walked alone at night since that evening. I've tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks, the result of too many late nights and too much caffeine. But deep down, I know what I heard. I know what I felt. Something was following me that night, something I couldn't explain. And now, every time I walk out into the darkness, I can't shake the feeling that it's still there, waiting for me to step back into its path. Story. The end.
Story number 8.
I've always been one to enjoy the quiet solitude of walking alone at night. There's something peaceful about it. The world is asleep, and for a brief moment, it feels like you can exist without any distractions. My apartment is a small, quiet one, nestled in a suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of town. It's not the kind of place where people walk around late at night, and that's just how I like it. I work at a local bar and usually end up walking home after my shift, which ends around 1 a.m. Most of the time, it's uneventful, just a peaceful walk through the dark streets, passing by the occasional streetlight, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the otherwise quiet air. It's a routine I've grown accustomed to. But one night, that routine was shattered. It started just like any other night. I had wrapped up my shift, said goodnight to my coworkers, and stepped outside into the cool night air. The moon was barely visible through a veil of clouds, and the streetlights cast dim pools of light along the sidewalk. The night was unusually still, no wind to stir the leaves or make the branches sway. It felt heavy somehow. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just my tiredness catching up with me. I started walking down the street toward my apartment, my shoes clicking against the pavement with each step. Everything seemed fine, quiet, normal. But then I heard it, a soft, scuffing sound like footsteps behind me. I paused, but there was no one in sight. The street was empty, and the only sound was the hum of the distant streetlights. I stood there for a moment, unsure of whether I'd heard anything at all. My mind was probably playing tricks on me, I thought. I continued walking, but the scuffing sound came again, slightly louder this time. My heart skipped a beat. I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing, just the quiet road stretching out behind me. I felt ridiculous. There was no one there. Maybe it was just an animal or the wind making a sound that I'd misinterpreted. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered. I quickened my pace, trying to shake the unease creeping over me. but the footsteps followed. They were there again, each one just slightly out of sync with my own, but undeniably real. I could hear them, faint but distinct, like someone was walking a few steps behind me, mimicking my movements. My heart rate increased, and I glanced over my shoulder again, almost certain that I would see someone there this time. Nothing. I told myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on me. There was no one following me. I was being paranoid. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I took a deep breath and tried to ignore the sound, forcing myself to keep walking at a steady pace. But then the footsteps grew louder, closer. I could almost feel the presence behind me now, like someone was standing just inches away, following me step for step. My breath became shallow as my anxiety started to spike. Without warning, I turned around abruptly. Nothing. I exhaled shakily, realizing how absurd I was being. There was no one there. I stood in the street for a moment, looking up and down, waiting for some sign of movement, but the road remained empty. I turned back around and started walking again, my pace now brisker. I couldn't explain it, but I just wanted to be home. The air felt colder somehow, heavier. The streetlights flickered once, twice, casting strange shadows that seemed to move in ways they shouldn't. I could feel my skin prickling, and despite the silence, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The footsteps resumed. This time, they were unmistakably there, louder, clearer. Someone was following me. I could hear the scuff of shoes on the sidewalk, slightly out of rhythm with my own footsteps, but they were there, and they were getting closer. I stopped again, turning quickly to face the empty street behind me. There was no one there. No one at all. My heart was pounding now. I felt a cold sweat trickling down my back. It wasn't just the footsteps anymore. It was the sheer feeling of dread that washed over me, like something was lurking in the shadows, just beyond my line of sight. I stood frozen, listening. The footsteps continued, but now they seemed to be right behind me. I couldn't deny it anymore. There was someone there, someone walking right behind me, though I couldn't see them. My eyes darted to every corner, every darkened alleyway, but there was no one in sight. Panic rose in my chest. I started walking again, quicker this time, practically breaking into a jog. The footsteps matched my pace. They were right behind me, too close now, too real. I could feel the presence, as if someone's breath was on my neck. I couldn't take it any longer. I turned around, heart racing, fully expecting to see someone standing just behind me. Nothing. It was then that I saw it, a figure standing in the distance, just under the farthest streetlight. A person, but not really. They were too tall, and their figure was distorted, almost like they were standing too straight, too rigid, as if they were trying to blend in with the shadows. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew one thing. This wasn't just a passerby. I froze in place. The footsteps stopped too. It was like everything went still, like time itself had paused. For a long moment, we just stood there, me staring at the figure, and the figure staring at me. I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead. Then the figure took a step forward, just one. Slow, deliberate, its shadow stretching unnaturally long across the sidewalk. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran. I didn't care how silly I looked or how fast my heart was beating. I just ran, my legs pumping hard, my breath coming in gasps. I didn't dare look back. The footsteps followed again, right behind me, matching every stride just as they had before. I reached my apartment building, nearly out of breath, and I fumbled with my keys, my hands trembling. The footsteps were still there, but as I stepped into the building and slammed the door shut behind me, they stopped. I stood there for a few minutes, my back pressed against the door, listening for any sign of movement outside. The building was silent. No footsteps. No presence. I never told anyone about that night. The next morning, everything seemed normal again. The sun was out, and the streets were busy with people going about their day. But every time I walk home now, even in broad daylight, I feel it, just a slight sensation, a quiet whisper in the back of my mind that something might be following me. Story the end.
Story number 9.
It was around 11:30 p.m. when I started my walk home, the cold air cutting through the streets. I worked late at the library downtown and had gotten into the habit of walking the 20-minute route back to my apartment after finishing my shift. The walk was peaceful and gave me a chance to clear my head. The streets were always quiet at night, and the streetlights gave off a warm, reassuring glow, though it always felt a little more subdued when you walked alone in the dark. That night, however, something was different. I couldn't pinpoint what, but the atmosphere felt off. The city, usually bustling even late in the evening, felt eerily still. The distant sound of traffic was muffled, almost as if the world was holding its breath. I had walked this same path countless times, and yet tonight it felt like I was walking in a dream where nothing was quite as it should be. I pulled my jacket tighter against the chill and pushed on. The first part of my walk took me down an empty side street, lined with old tall trees whose branches reached toward the sky like skeletal hands. Their shadows stretched long across the sidewalk, making the night feel even darker. I passed by an old house that had always looked strange to me, abandoned and weathered, with boarded up windows and an overgrown front yard. It was the kind of house that didn't seem to belong in the neighborhood, and I never liked walking by it after dark. But that night, I couldn't help but glance at it as I passed. Just as I did, I heard something. A faint sound, like the rustling of leaves, but it wasn't coming from the trees. It was behind me. I stopped for a second, straining my ears. The rustling continued, followed by a soft thud, almost like footsteps. I turned quickly, but no one was there. My pulse quickened. I was certain I hadn't heard anyone approach, yet there was no mistaking it. The sound had been real. I shook my head, trying to brush off the unsettling feeling, telling myself it was probably just the wind. I continued walking, but the feeling of being watched crept up my spine. It was a sensation I couldn't shake, like someone or something was behind me, following my every step. My pace quickened, but the footsteps behind me seemed to match mine, falling into rhythm. They were faint, but unmistakable. I turned again, and still there was no one there. The street was as empty as it had been moments before. My heart began to race. There was no explanation for it, but the sound of those footsteps was real. I wasn't imagining it. I walked faster now, feeling that sense of dread creeping in, making every part of me want to look over my shoulder. But I resisted. If I turned around, I would be confirming something that I didn't want to admit. Then, just as I passed an alleyway, I heard something else. A voice, soft, almost a whisper. My name. I froze. It was so quiet I almost thought I had imagined it, but there it was again, more distinct this time. My name. Claire. I whipped around, but again there was no one there. I couldn't see anyone lurking in the shadows or standing by the streetlights. The alley was empty, as was the street. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared down the darkened path. I didn't want to admit it, but the fear had already settled in, curling in the pit of my stomach. I began walking faster, trying to calm my breathing. I could hear the footsteps again, and this time they were closer, almost too close. The echo of my own footsteps mingled with the faint ones behind me, creating a discordant rhythm that made my skin crawl. By the time I reached the main road, I was practically running. The streetlights here were brighter, and I could see more clearly. But it didn't help. I could still hear the footsteps, now almost directly behind me. There was no one around, just the empty road, the empty sidewalks. But the sound was unmistakable. The footsteps were so close that I could almost feel the presence behind me, the weight of someone's gaze on my back. I reached the intersection near my apartment building, and as I stepped onto the crosswalk, the footsteps abruptly stopped. I paused for a moment, my breath shaky, and turned to look behind me. Still no one. I was at the entrance of my apartment building now, but something made me hesitate before I entered. I could feel a knot in my stomach, a strange sensation that something wasn't right. I glanced around once more, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the street was as empty as it had been all night. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me and leaning against it as if it could protect me from whatever had followed me. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I could still hear my own breathing, my heartbeat thumping in my ears. I told myself it had to have been my imagination. It had to have been. There was no logical reason for what had happened, but the feeling didn't go away. I went up to my apartment, trying to shake off the unease, but the moment I stepped inside, something felt wrong. The lights flickered briefly, and I froze, staring at the ceiling for a second before shrugging it off. I went to the kitchen to make some tea, anything to calm my nerves, but as I stood there, something caught my eye. A shadow moving in the corner of my vision. I turned, but when I looked directly at it, it was gone. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and despite all my attempts to convince myself that everything was fine, I couldn't ignore the nagging fear in the back of my mind. I couldn't shake the image of those footsteps, the voice calling my name, the overwhelming sense that something was there in the shadows, watching me. I sat on the couch, staring out the window, trying to calm my thoughts. The street lights outside illuminated the street below, but something felt off about them, as though the light didn't quite reach the places it should. I felt cold suddenly, though the heat was on, and I wrapped myself in a blanket. The temperature in the room had dropped, though I couldn't figure out why. The silence of my apartment felt suffocating. Just as I closed my eyes, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling, I heard it again, a soft whisper, my name. Claire? I jumped up, my heart racing, my blood running cold. I looked around the apartment, the space seeming suddenly too large, too empty. My breath came in short bursts as I strained to listen for any movement, any sound that didn't belong, but there was nothing. The apartment was still, the air thick with silence, and yet I could feel it, the presence. Something was there, in the room with me. I ran to the door, bolting it again, and locked myself inside the bathroom, trying to steady my breathing, trying to calm my shaking hands, but the fear was all-consuming. I couldn't escape it. That night, I didn't sleep. The voice, the footsteps, the sense of being watched, it never left me. I could still hear the echo of those footsteps, even now, years later, whenever I walk alone at night. Story the end.
Story number 10.
I've never been one to scare easily, but there was this one night that I will never forget. It was late October, and I had just finished up a late shift at the bookstore. My small town isn't the kind of place where things happen after dark, and I've always felt safe walking home. The streets are quiet and the houses cozy. My walk home was the same as it had been countless times before, but that night, something was different. Something I couldn't explain, no matter how much I tried. I stepped out of the warm bookstore into the chill of the night air, adjusting my scarf around my neck. The streetlights flickered weakly as I walked down the main road, my footsteps the only sound. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the sky was so dark it all felt like the night was swallowing me up. I had about a 10-minute walk ahead of me before I reached my small apartment on the edge of town. At first, everything felt normal. The usual stillness of the night wrapped itself around me, and I adjusted to the rhythm of my footsteps. I'd taken this route hundreds of times before. I'd learned to appreciate the silence, the absence of the usual daytime noise that fills the air with distractions. Tonight, however, the quiet felt almost oppressive. It wasn't until I passed the park that something caught my attention. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I noticed a figure sitting on one of the benches. The park was always empty this time of night, especially on weekdays. The figure was a man, at least it looked like one, but he was slouched forward, head down, as if he were asleep or lost in thought. It wasn't unusual to see someone sitting there at this time, but something about the way he sat made me uneasy. It was too still, too silent. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was nothing. People are often out late, especially in a small town like this. But as I passed by the park, I glanced over my shoulder. The man hadn't moved. I couldn't help but feel that he was watching me, his posture unnaturally rigid. I shook off the thought and continued on my way. But the unsettling feeling lingered. As I walked further down the street, I started to hear something that made my stomach tighten. A soft rustling sound, like footsteps, following mine. It was subtle at first, but unmistakable. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the sound of my own shoes against the pavement, echoing in my mind. I picked up my pace, but the footsteps seemed to match my own, getting closer with each stride. I glanced over my shoulder again, half expecting to see someone walking just behind me. But there was no one there. The street was empty. I stopped for a moment, trying to calm myself, convincing myself I was imagining things. After all, it's just late-night nerves, right? Still, my heart rate had picked up, and the sensation of being watched was creeping over me. I kept walking, but the footsteps continued. Every step I took was mirrored by a soft, almost indistinguishable sound behind me. I didn't want to turn around again, didn't want to confirm what I already suspected, but I couldn't help myself. I quickly glanced behind me, my breath catching in my throat. No one. The street was completely empty. I kept walking, my pace now noticeably faster. The footsteps followed. I could feel them, like a presence right behind me. I wanted to stop and turn around, confront whatever was following me, but the thought of doing that filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. I walked faster, nearly breaking into a run, but the footsteps did the same. They matched my every movement. My pulse raced in my ears as I could almost feel someone's breath on the back of my neck. I reached the end of the block, where I'd normally turn left toward my apartment. As I approached the corner, I heard the footsteps once again, now unmistakably louder, closer. That's when I heard it, a soft voice. "Excuse me." I froze. The voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it was unmistakable. My heart slammed against my chest, and I slowly turned toward the sound. There was no one behind me. I was alone, standing on the edge of the sidewalk. The streetlights cast long shadows, but nothing was there. The voice had come from nowhere. No one was in sight. I stood there, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I was just tired, that's all. But the panic in my chest refused to calm. I looked around again, just to make sure, but all I could see were the empty streets and the darkened houses. No one was there. I started walking again, my heart thumping in my chest, but this time I didn't look back. I couldn't. I didn't want to hear those footsteps anymore. I just wanted to get home. The street was quiet now, the only sound my hurried footsteps and the occasional creak of a nearby tree swaying in the wind. But even as I neared my apartment building, the air around me felt thick with something I couldn't explain. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking, and when I finally managed to unlock the door, I quickly stepped inside, slamming it behind me. I leaned against the door for a long moment, trying to calm my breath, trying to convince myself that it had all been a product of my imagination. But something was different. The moment I entered the building, I felt it. The same sensation of being watched, the same chill crawling up my spine. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up again. I didn't stay in the hallway for long. I rushed up the stairs to my apartment, not daring to look back. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The eerie silence had returned, but it felt like it was closing in around me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. I kept hearing noises, the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of something in the shadows. But when I opened my eyes to look, everything was still. I've walked home many times since that night, but I've never quite been the same. The streets don't feel as quiet anymore, and I always find myself glancing over my shoulder, just in case. Sometimes, late at night, I hear footsteps behind me matching my own. I still don't know if I'm just imagining it, or if something followed me that night. But I do know this, there's something out there, something that lingers in the shadows, waiting, and it's always watching.
Story number 11.
It was one of those late autumn nights when the cold seems to bite right through you, even if you're bundled up in a jacket. The streets were quieter than usual, with only the sound of my footsteps echoing against the pavement. I was walking home from a friend's place, about a 25-minute walk through the quieter, older part of town. My phone had died hours ago, and I hadn't bothered charging it, so I was left with nothing but the sounds of the night for company. The streetlights flickered sporadically, casting long, distorted shadows across the sidewalks. I'd walked this route dozens of times before, and it had always been peaceful, even a little calming. But tonight was different. As I walked past the old brick church, its spire rising stark against the dark sky, I noticed something out of place. A figure standing near the corner of the churchyard. It was hard to make out from the distance, but there was something about it that felt wrong. The figure was tall and still, too still. The kind of stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I kept walking, trying to ignore the unease settling in my stomach, but the feeling didn't go away. It only intensified as I passed the church, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few steps, certain I was being watched. There was no one there, not at first, but the sensation didn't leave me. I quickened my pace. The wind picked up, rustling the branches of the trees lining the street, and I thought I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, measured, but unmistakable. I froze. My breath hitched in my chest. The sound of footsteps was real, but there was no one around. My pulse quickened. The figure. The sensation of being watched. I couldn't shake it. I turned around, fully expecting to see someone trailing behind me. But the street was empty. Only the faint glow of the streetlights illuminated the path ahead. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I started walking faster, then broke into a jog. The footsteps behind me grew louder, closer. Whoever, whatever, was behind me had picked up the pace too. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted, my breath coming in short bursts. I didn't know why I was running, but I couldn't stop myself. The footsteps were right there, close enough to feel like someone was breathing down my neck. I dared not look back. As I neared a small alley that cut through to another street, I felt a hand, cold, clammy, brush against the back of my jacket. I screamed, spinning around, my hands flailing, but there was no one. Nothing. My heart was racing, my legs trembling beneath me as I backed away from the alley, my eyes scanning the street in a panic. It was empty. Completely empty. I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what was happening. But the sense of unease had only deepened, like something had shifted in the air, like the night itself was holding its breath. I was about to keep moving when I heard it. A whisper. Soft, but distinct. Don't run. It came from the alley. My eyes snapped to the shadows there, but I couldn't see anyone. There was nothing but darkness, thick and suffocating, like the night itself was swallowing the light. I turned and sprinted, not caring about the path or where I was headed, just desperate to get away. My mind was racing, thoughts tumbling over each other in a blur. The footsteps were back, closing in on me, but when I glanced over my shoulder, there was no one there. No figure. No one at all. Just the street, dark and empty. I reached the corner of the street, the one that led to my building, but I didn't stop. My feet carried me forward, my legs moving on their own, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't want to stop, didn't want to be anywhere near that alley, near the thing that had been following me. When I finally reached the entrance of my apartment building, I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The footsteps had stopped. At least they weren't there anymore. But that didn't mean I was safe. That feeling of being watched hadn't disappeared. I rushed into the building, pushing the door closed behind me. I leaned against it, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The air inside felt heavy, as though the weight of whatever had been following me had come inside with me. I took the stairs two at a time, desperate to get to my apartment. I could feel it again, the heavy presence. Someone, or something, was still with me. The elevator was out of order, and I didn't care to wait for it anyway. I needed to be inside my apartment, locked away where nothing could reach me. When I got to my door, I almost collapsed as I fumbled with the key. My hands were slick with sweat, the key slipping in and out of my grasp as my heart thundered in my chest. Finally, I managed to get the door open and stepped inside, slamming it shut behind me. I bolted the lock, slid the deadbolt into place, and stood there for a moment, panting, trying to steady my breath. I pressed my back to the door, my eyes darting around the apartment, checking every corner, every shadow. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew I wasn't alone. The feeling of being watched was still there, lingering like a presence in the room. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, checking the windows, the doors. The streetlights outside flickered in the distance, casting long, wavering shadows across the walls. Every creak of the building made my heart jump in my throat. The next morning, I told myself I had been imagining things. Maybe the stress from work, the late night, the quiet streets had all combined into some sort of hallucination. But even as I walked to work that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The street seemed emptier than usual, the shadows deeper. I found myself walking faster than normal, my eyes darting around, expecting to see someone lurking in the darkness, waiting. I didn't want to believe it, but every step I took, I couldn't escape the memory of that night, of the footsteps, of the whisper, of the hand on my back. I never walked home alone at night again, not after that night. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the whisper. still feel the cold hand brushing against my jacket, and sometimes when I look out the window, I see a figure standing in the distance, just beyond the reach of the streetlights. I don't go near the window anymore. Story the end.
Story number 12.
It was one of those nights when the fog hung low over the town, thick and heavy, swallowing everything in its path. The streetlights barely pierced through the haze, casting faint halos of light that seemed to evaporate as soon as they touched the ground. I had just finished my late shift at the local diner, a small 24-hour spot that stayed open for the few of us who were out after dark. The walk home was usually uneventful, just a quick jaunt down the main road, leaks past the same old houses, until I reached my apartment. I wasn't particularly scared of walking alone at night. The town was small and the streets were empty, quiet. But that night, something felt different. It had been a slow night at the diner, and I was exhausted. My feet ached, my mind was foggy, and all I wanted was to get back to my apartment, take a hot shower, and fall into bed. I locked the door behind me and started down the street, the only sound being the crunch of gravel under my boots. The fog made the world feel strange, like I wasn't quite in the same place anymore. The shapes of the houses, the trees, the sidewalks, they all seemed to blur together in a way that made it hard to get a sense of distance. I kept my head down and tried to walk quickly, but the eerie stillness of the night made every step feel heavier than the last. I was about halfway home when I first noticed the figure. It was standing just ahead, near a row of bushes. At first I thought it was just a shadow, maybe a person walking on the other side of the street. But as I got closer, I realized that the shape wasn't moving at all. It was just standing there, perfectly still, facing away from me. My heart began to beat a little faster, and I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something wrong about it, something off. It was too still, too quiet. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just someone waiting for a bus or standing outside a house, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at the pit of my stomach. I quickened my pace, but as I drew closer, the figure didn't move. It just stood there, like it was waiting. Then, just as I was about to pass it, the figure turned, slowly. The motion was so deliberate, so unnatural that I froze in place. The person standing there wasn't anyone I recognized. They were tall, too tall, unnaturally so, and their face was obscured by the darkness, their features hidden under the hood of a heavy coat. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other in the dim light. I don't know how long we stood there, but it felt like an eternity. My breath caught in my throat, and I forced myself to take a step back. That's when it spoke. "Are you lost?" The voice was soft, almost too soft, and it seemed to echo in the fog. It was a question, but there was something wrong with it. It wasn't a simple inquiry. It felt wrong, like the words were laced with something darker, something I couldn't name. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. I wasn't lost. I wasn't even close to being lost. So why did this person, whoever they were, feel like they were blocking my path? "I'm not lost," I finally managed to say, my voice shaky. "I'm just walking home." The figure didn't respond right away. Instead, it tilted its head slightly as though considering my words. I felt the air grow colder, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I didn't want to stay here any longer, but for some reason, my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, frozen in place. And then, before I could react, the figure started to move toward me. I immediately took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. The fog around us seemed to swirl and shift, closing in, thickening. I couldn't see anything beyond the figure, nothing beyond the faint glow of the streetlights. The world around me had shrunk down to this one spot, and everything outside of it felt distant, unreachable. "Are you sure you're not lost?" The voice came again, this time closer, much closer. I could feel its presence now, like it was right next to me, even though I couldn't see it. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I felt like I was trapped in some kind of dream, one where everything around me was out of my control. My legs were shaking, my breath shallow, and I realized I was backing away, slowly, too slowly, toward the streetlight. "Please," I whispered, not sure what I was begging for, but the words just slipped out. There was a long pause. Then the figure stepped forward, and then it was gone. The fog lifted in an instant, like someone had pulled back a curtain. The figure wasn't standing in front of me anymore. I blinked in confusion, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I had been standing there, frozen in fear, but now the street was empty. There was no one around. The sense of dread lingered, crawling under my skin, but I couldn't explain what had happened. Had I imagined it? Had I been so tired that my mind was playing tricks on me? I didn't stick around to figure it out. Without a second thought, I turned and ran the rest of the way home. I could still hear my heart hammering in my chest, the sound of my boots pounding against the pavement, but I didn't stop until I reached my apartment. When I got inside, I locked the door behind me and collapsed against it, trying to catch my breath. I couldn't stop shaking, and my mind kept replaying the encounter over and over again. I knew what I had seen, what I had felt, but I also knew that no one would believe me if I told them. It was too bizarre, too impossible. I never walked home late again. Even when I had to work late shifts, I always made sure to catch a ride home or take a bus. And every time I passed that part of town, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure again. But I never did. Months passed, and life returned to normal. But every time the fog rolled in, I couldn't help but feel the same unease, the same dread creeping over me. And sometimes when I'm out walking late at night, I can't shake the feeling that someone is watching me, waiting. I never saw the figure again, but I know it's still out there, lurking in the fog, waiting for someone to cross its path. And I wonder, if I hadn't walked away that night, would I have been lost too? Story the end.
Story number 13.
It was just after midnight when I started my walk home. I had been at a friend's place for the evening, and now the streets were deserted, the city wrapped in a blanket of silence. I had always liked the quiet, especially at night. But tonight felt different, the kind of different you can't explain, but you feel deep in your gut. Something in the air was heavy, charged with an unfamiliar tension. I lived in a neighborhood on the edge of town, this where the lights were dimmer and the streets were quieter than the more bustling areas closer to downtown. Normally, the walk didn't bother me. I had made it hundreds of times without a second thought. But tonight, as I left my friend's house and stepped into the cold, dark streets, I noticed that everything felt off. The wind was still, and the usual hum of distant traffic seemed muted, almost non-existent. The streetlights flickered in and out, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and sway unnaturally. As I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder. At first, I told myself it was just my nerves, but there was something unsettling about the emptiness of the street. I had never felt so isolated in this part of town. The houses seemed darker, as if they were hiding something. The street seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, with no one in sight. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and quickened my pace. A few blocks from the main road, I passed by a small park. The swing set was still and unmoving, the old metal creaking in the wind. The park had always been a quiet, peaceful place, but tonight it felt different. As I walked past the entrance, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing near the farthest bench. It was just a shadow, but it looked wrong, too tall, too still. I didn't know why, but something in my chest tightened. I picked up the pace, not wanting to look back. The footsteps behind me were the first thing I noticed. At first, they were faint, just a slight echo of my own steps, but as I walked faster, they grew louder. Someone was walking behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I resisted the urge to turn around. It was probably just another late-night walker, I told myself. Maybe someone was cutting through the park too, on their way home. But as I walked faster, so did the footsteps. They matched my pace perfectly. No matter how quickly I moved, the sound of those footsteps remained just behind me. I tried to convince myself that I was overthinking it. My heart was pounding, and my mind was racing with the possibility of a prank, someone just messing with me. But then the footsteps grew louder still, closer, and I knew I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't alone. I turned down a side street, desperate to shake whoever was following me. But the footsteps didn't stop. In fact, they grew louder, more deliberate, as if whoever was behind me had started to run. I glanced behind me for a fraction of a second and froze. There was no one there. The street was empty. I was alone. But the footsteps, unmistakably, continued. They were right there, behind me, too close. My breath hitched in my throat, and I broke into a full sprint, my heart pounding in my chest. I ran through the empty streets, my shoes slapping against the pavement, but the footsteps continued. They were right behind me, the rhythm of them so close I could feel them echoing in my bones. I could almost hear someone breathing, their steps matching mine with terrifying precision. I dared not look back again, afraid of what I might see. I reached the intersection and cut down another alley, hoping to lose whoever or whatever was following me. I turned sharply, my feet moving faster than I ever had before. But when I turned down a narrow street, the footsteps stopped. For a brief moment, I thought I had outrun whatever it was, but then I heard the whisper. It was a soft sound just at the edge of hearing, but it was unmistakable. My name, Ellen. I froze. My blood turned cold. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I just stood there, staring straight ahead, my body rigid with fear. The whisper came again, this time louder. Ellen, don't run. My legs felt like lead. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I was paralyzed by the voice, the unmistakable sound of my own name, but I didn't recognize it. It wasn't anyone I knew. It was a voice that came from somewhere deeper, somewhere darker, as if it had been waiting for me. Suddenly, the air around me grew colder, the temperature dropping so quickly that I could see my breath misting in front of me. I could feel the presence of something, someone behind me. I turned my head slightly, just enough to glance at the shadowy corner where the alley intersected with the street, but there was nothing. No figure, no person, just darkness. I couldn't take it anymore. My instincts kicked in, and I bolted again, running as fast as I could. My heart was racing, my lungs burning, but the footsteps followed me. They were there, right behind me. No matter how fast I went, I heard them, felt them, in the pit of my stomach, like an invisible hand gripping me. I glanced to my side, desperate to see what was chasing me, but there was nothing. No one. The alley opened up into a more familiar part of town, the streetlights flickering back to life, and I didn't slow down until I reached the main road. I turned the corner, nearly stumbling over my own feet as I skidded to a stop in front of the nearest convenience store, its bright lights flooding the street. I stood there for a moment, panting, trembling. The footsteps had stopped. The voice had stopped. I dared to look around, trying to gather my thoughts. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But the streets were empty now, as empty as they had been when I started my walk. I kept my eyes trained on the sidewalk as I made my way to the nearby bus stop, praying that whatever had been following me wouldn't return. I waited for what felt like an eternity, my heart still pounding, my mind whirling with fear. When the bus finally arrived, I climbed aboard without hesitation, sitting at the back of the bus and watching the streets pass by through the window. I didn't walk home that night. I took the bus the rest of the way. The feeling of being watched lingered for days afterward. Every time I walked down a street alone at night, I felt that same creeping sensation, like someone was behind me, just out of sight. I told myself it was just my imagination, the result of an overactive mind. But deep down, I knew something had happened that night, something I couldn't explain. Even now, when I walk alone in the dark, I can still hear the footsteps, still feel that presence, like it's always there, just waiting for me to turn around. Story, the end.
Story number 14.
I've always preferred walking alone at night. There's something about the quiet, the stillness that calms me. The world feels different, less chaotic when everyone is asleep and the only sounds are your own footsteps. I'd taken this same route countless times, winding through the sleepy streets of my neighborhood after work, letting my mind wander. It was my time to decompress, to escape the pressures of the day. One evening, after a particularly long day at the office, I decided to take my usual walk. It was around midnight when I left the building, the city lights casting a faint glow across the empty streets. The cool air brushed against my face as I tucked my hands into my jacket pockets and started walking, the rhythm of my steps echoing in the quiet. I'd always felt safe in my neighborhood, so the fact that I was walking alone at night didn't faze me. But tonight was different. It wasn't something I could put into words, but there was a heaviness in the air that felt wrong. The usual calmness of the night seemed almost thick, like it was pressing down on me. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just the exhaustion from the day catching up with me. As I walked past the old park at the end of the block, I noticed a figure sitting on one of the benches. It was a man, hunched over, his back to me. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, some people like to sit in the park at night, especially when the weather was mild. But there was something odd about this man. He sat so still, almost unnaturally so. And his posture, his shoulders hunched forward, his head lowered as if he were staring at the ground, was unsettling. I slowed my pace, trying to make sense of the situation. Why would someone be sitting out here at this hour, completely still? It didn't feel right, but I continued walking, hoping that my overactive imagination was getting the best of me. But as I passed the park, something made me glance over my shoulder. The man hadn't moved, but I could swear I felt his eyes on me. Uh, it was an odd sensation, like he was watching me even though I hadn't seen his face. I quickened my pace, trying to shake off the unease that was creeping over me. A few blocks later, I took a shortcut down a narrow alley to avoid the main road. The alley was quiet, lined with old brick buildings and darkened doorways. I had taken this path many times before, but tonight it felt different. The shadows seemed deeper, darker than usual. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I walked through the narrow space between the buildings. My footsteps echoed off the walls, and for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me. I stopped for a moment, listening. There was nothing, just the distant hum of traffic and the rustling of leaves. I took another step, and then another. But then I heard it. Footsteps. Soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. They were behind me, the sound of someone walking in sync with my movements. I froze. My heart started to race as I tried to calm myself. It was probably just someone else out for a late-night stroll, right? But when I glanced over my shoulder, the alley was empty. No one was there. I quickly turned back and kept walking, my pace quickening. But the footsteps continued, always a step behind me. They were slower now, but they were still there. Every time I moved, they moved. I could feel them following me as though someone was right on my heels. I reached the end of the alley and turned onto the main road, hoping that the open street would offer some relief. But as I stepped onto the sidewalk, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The footsteps had stopped. The air around me seemed to shift, like a heavy weight had been lifted. For a brief moment, I thought I had imagined the whole thing. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. A shadow. Just a flicker, but enough to make my heart skip a beat. I looked again, but it was gone. I walked faster, my breath coming in shallow gasps, trying to shake off the feeling that I was being watched. But it didn't go away. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw nothing, but I couldn't escape the feeling that something was lurking in the dark, waiting for me. I reached the intersection near my apartment building and hesitated. I could see the familiar glow of the streetlights, the comfort of home just a few blocks away, but I couldn't shake the sense of dread that had settled in my chest. I was about to cross the street when I heard a voice. "Excuse me." It was soft, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. I turned, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one there. The street was empty, the road stretching out before me, bathed in the soft light of the street lamps. I scanned the area, my eyes darting from one shadow to the next. Nothing. No one. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned back toward the street, determined to get home as quickly as possible. The air felt colder now, and every step seemed to echo louder than the last. I reached my apartment building, fumbling for my keys with trembling hands. When I finally unlocked the door and stepped inside, I slammed it shut behind me, my breath ragged, my pulse still racing. I leaned against the door, trying to steady myself, but the unease didn't dissipate. It lingered, curling around me like a dark cloud. I had no idea what had happened or what I had experienced, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever it wasn't over. Over the next few days, I tried to put the events of that night out of my mind. I told myself it was just a combination of exhaustion and a vivid imagination. But the sense of being followed never quite left me. Every time I walked alone at night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind me, just out of sight. I would hear footsteps, faint and distant, but when I turned around, there would be no one there. Eventually, I stopped walking alone at night. I couldn't bring myself to do it anymore. The fear that had taken root in my mind refused to let go. But even now, years later, I still can't explain what happened that night or why I still feel like something is watching me when the darkness falls. The city is quiet, the streets are empty, but sometimes, just sometimes, I'll hear a faint sound, a whisper on the wind, a shadow in the corner of my eye, and I know that whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 15.
It was a cold October evening when I found myself walking alone on a quiet street, making my way home from a friend's house. The kind of evening where the chill of the night wraps around you and every sound seems sharper, every shadow deeper. I'd taken this route countless times before, but tonight felt different. It was as though the air had thickened somehow, like something was waiting, watching. The streetlights flickered intermittently, casting long, jittery shadows on the sidewalk. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself, quickening my pace. The trees lining the road swayed in the wind, their leaves rustling in a rhythm that felt oddly like footsteps following me. I told myself it was just the wind, just my imagination, but the feeling of being watched never left. The neighborhood I walked through was a mix of older houses, some with well-kept yards, others with cracked windows and fading paint. I passed a few darkened houses, their windows staring back at me like empty eyes. It always felt empty at night, but I didn't mind. It was peaceful, quiet. As I approached a particularly old house at the corner of the block, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. I had passed it countless times, but tonight the house seemed alive. The shutters hung crookedly from the second floor, and the front yard was overgrown with weeds. The porch light was off, but in the darkness I thought I saw movement inside. A shadow, a shape. But when I looked closer, there was nothing. Just the dim glow of the streetlight from across the street casting shadows through the cracked windows. I tried to shake off the unease that was creeping up my spine and kept walking, but I couldn't ignore the nagging sensation that followed me, like someone was just behind me, waiting for me to turn around. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, but the street was empty. There was no one. I breathed a sigh of relief, but the sensation didn't go away. It only grew stronger, as if the very air around me was holding its breath. I looked ahead, my pace quickening again, desperate to get home. But no matter how fast I walked, the feeling of being watched remained. I passed a small park up ahead, the swings swaying gently in the wind. I had walked this way hundreds of times, but tonight the park looked different. The darkness seemed to consume the trees, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the park, near the old rusted fence. I stopped walking, my heart racing. The figure was tall and thin, standing motionless, staring in my direction. I couldn't make out any features, just a vague outline of a person blending into the shadows. I told myself it was probably just someone out for a late night walk, but something about the stillness of the figure felt wrong. I didn't want to look, but my eyes kept drifting back to it. The longer I stared, the more the figure seemed to move toward me, or at least that's how it felt. My mind raced with questions. Who would be out here at this hour? Why wasn't anyone else around? I turned away, deciding it was best to keep walking. But as I started to move, the figure seemed to follow my every step. It was like a magnet pulling at me, drawing me back toward the park. I could feel its presence now, so close. But when I glanced over my shoulder, there was nothing. No one. I quickened my pace again, but the feeling of being followed didn't fade. I was nearly at the end of the block when I heard it, a faint rustling sound behind me, like footsteps crunching on the dry leaves that covered the ground. I froze. My blood ran cold. I turned around, this time expecting to see someone close behind me. But the street was still empty, the shadows long and eerie under the flickering streetlights. There was no one. I felt ridiculous, standing there in the middle of the street, looking over my shoulder like I had imagined everything. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. I could feel it. Someone or something was there, watching me, waiting. My mind raced. I needed to get home. I needed to make sure the doors were locked. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I turned back around and began walking faster, my footsteps echoing in the silence of the night. The street seemed endless, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I passed the old house again, I caught sight of the same shadow in the window. The figure had moved, or so it seemed, It was closer now, just inside the window, staring out at me. I felt a surge of panic rise in my chest, and I broke into a jog, my heart pounding in my ears. I couldn't stop looking behind me. I couldn't stop myself from checking every corner, every shadow, expecting to see someone or something step out from the darkness. It was then that I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me, quickening with every stride I took. They were real. Someone was following me. My breath hitched in my chest. I turned my head, fully expecting to see the figure from the park right behind me. But when I looked, there was nothing. The street was still empty. The footsteps didn't stop, though. They kept pace with me, just behind my heels, matching my every step. My legs felt like lead, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't run anymore. I couldn't keep up the pace. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight, constricted with fear. I turned down the alley between two houses, hoping to lose whatever was following me. But the footsteps were still there, still behind me. I reached the back door of my house, fumbled for my keys, and finally managed to get the door open. I slammed it shut behind me and locked it with trembling hands. My pulse was still racing, my breath ragged in my chest. I didn't even stop to take off my shoes or jacket. I just leaned against the door, trying to calm myself, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But I couldn't. The footsteps were still there, echoing in my mind like they were right outside the door, waiting for me to open it. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening for any sound, any sign that the figure from the park, or whatever it was, had followed me inside. Finally, after what felt like hours, I dared to peek through the peephole in the door. The street outside was empty. The night was still. But the sensation of being watched was still there, lingering like a dark shadow, pressing in on me. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind made me jump. And when I finally managed to close my eyes, I still heard those footsteps in my head, just behind me. I couldn't escape them. The next day, I tried to convince myself it was just a figment of my imagination. Maybe the isolation of the night had played tricks on me. But every time I walked alone at night after that, the memory of those footsteps, the feeling of being followed, haunted me. I never walked that street again. And to this day, when I walk alone, I swear I can still hear the faintest echo of footsteps behind me, just beyond the reach of the streetlights. Story the end.
Story number 16.
I used to enjoy walking alone at night. There was something peaceful about it, a calmness that settled over me as I walked through the quiet streets, the air cool against my skin, the world around me wrapped in darkness. I never really felt afraid until that one night. It happened in the small town I grew up in, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where you can walk for miles without ever worrying about your safety. I was 22 at the time, just finishing up my shift at the local bookstore. It was a Thursday night, and I had decided to take the usual walk home, a route I'd taken countless times without incident. The moon was full, casting long shadows on the empty streets. The town was silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and started down the familiar path. The walk from the bookstore to my apartment wasn't long, just a little under 30 minutes. It was a peaceful walk, or at least it had always been. But tonight, something felt different. The air was thick, and there was a strange heaviness to the silence. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. It wasn't a feeling of being followed, not exactly, but rather a sense that someone or something was watching me from the shadows. I pushed the thought to the back of my mind and quickened my pace. The main street was a few blocks ahead, and I would be safe once I reached it. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the unease that was creeping over me. I reached the corner where the sidewalk met the old alley that led to the back of the park. Normally, I would have just stayed on the main road, but tonight I turned down the alley instead. It was shorter and more direct, and I was eager to get home. The streetlights were dim in this part of town, and the alley felt almost unnaturally dark, the shadows deep and stretching out like long fingers. As I walked through the alley, I heard something. Footsteps, soft but distinct. I stopped, listening intently, and the sound stopped with me. It was as though the world had gone completely still. I took a deep breath, telling myself it was just the wind or maybe the sound of my own footsteps echoing off the walls of the alley. I kept walking, trying to convince myself that there was no reason to be scared. But then the footsteps started again, and this time they were closer. I quickened my pace, my heart beginning to race. I tried to stay calm, thinking it could be anyone, a late night jogger, someone else taking the shortcut through the alley. But when I turned a corner, I didn't see anyone. The alley was empty. I slowed down, glancing behind me, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the alley. A man, or at least what looked like a man. He was dressed in dark clothes, standing perfectly still, just out of the reach of the streetlight. I couldn't make out his face, but his posture seemed off, stiff, like he was waiting for something or someone. I stopped in my tracks, my breath caught in my throat. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up as I stared at the figure. There was something strange about him, something wrong. I took a step back, my heart pounding, and that's when he moved. Slowly, deliberately, he started walking toward me. His steps were heavy, slow, as though he was savoring each one. I felt a wave of panic wash over me, my legs frozen in place, unable to move. It was as though I was being drawn in, pulled toward him. I turned to run, but my feet felt like they were stuck in cement. Every step felt like an effort, like the ground was pushing back against me. I glanced behind me again, and he was closer now, moving with a strange, deliberate slowness, like he was toying with me. Finally, I found my legs and sprinted toward the end of the alley. My heart was pounding in my chest, the sound of my footsteps loud in my ears, but I didn't dare look back. I reached the end of the alley, burst onto the main road, and kept running, not stopping until I was at the entrance of my apartment building. I rushed inside, slamming the door behind me, and leaned against it, gasping for breath. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was it some prank? A random encounter with a stranger? I couldn't shake the image of the man in the alley, his unnerving stillness, the way he had moved so slowly, deliberately, as though he had all the time in the world. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, too shaken to sleep, my thoughts a jumble of confusion and fear. I kept replaying the events over and over in my mind, wondering if I had missed something, something that would explain what had happened. The next morning, I decided to go back to the alley. Maybe I was just overreacting. Maybe there was some logical explanation for what had happened. But when I reached the alley, it felt just as eerie as it had the night before. The same oppressive silence, the same deep shadows. There was no sign of anyone, of course. The alley was empty, just like it always was during the day. I stood there for a long moment, trying to convince myself that it had all been a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew it hadn't been. I could still hear the sound of the footsteps in my mind, could still feel the fear that had gripped me as I ran down the alley, the feeling of being watched, hunted. As I stood there staring down the alley, I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the far end of the alley, just beyond the corner where I had first seen him, was a single shoe, a worn, dark shoe lying in the dirt. I knelt down, my heart racing, and picked it up. It wasn't a shoe that I recognized, but it looked old, worn down, like it had been there for years. I glanced around again, but there was no one in sight, no sign of anyone. I looked back at the shoe, then at the street, then back down the alley, a cold shiver running down my spine. I left the alley and went home, but something had changed in me that night. I didn't walk alone at night anymore, and whenever I passed that alley, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, waiting. I haven't told anyone about that night. Who would believe me? They'd think I was imagining things, or worse, that I was simply paranoid. But I know what I felt, and I know what I saw. To this day, I wonder if that man was real, or if he was something else entirely, something that was never meant to be seen. Story: The End.
Story number 17.
I had always been one to enjoy the calmness of walking alone at night. There was something about the silence, the stillness, that made me feel at peace. The streetlights, casting their yellow glow on the pavement, created a kind of refuge from the dark. I used to take these walks all the time, nothing to worry about, just my thoughts and the hum of the night air. That night, though, something was different. Something felt off. It was around 11 p.m. when I left the small cafe near my apartment. The streets were mostly empty, except for the occasional car passing by. I had just finished my shift and decided to take the long way home, walking through the park instead of taking the shortcut down the main street. It was a chilly night, the kind where you feel the cold seeping through your jacket, and I zipped it up tighter as I walked. The crunch of the fallen leaves under my boots the only sound around me. The park was a familiar place. I had walked through it countless times, even at night when it was darker, the trees casting long shadows across the path. Tonight, though, the shadows seemed to stretch a little longer, the trees standing eerily still. The usual rustle of leaves in the wind was absent, and the air felt heavier. There were no distant sounds of laughter, no faint music from nearby apartments. It was just me and the quiet of the night. As I continued down the path, something caught my eye. A figure. I stopped walking, my breath catching in my throat. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but there, standing just under one of the trees, was a person. They were tall, cloaked in dark clothing, their back to me. I couldn't make out their face, but something about their stillness unsettled me. I stood there for a moment, watching them, unsure of whether I should approach or turn back. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. After a few moments of hesitation, I decided to keep walking, telling myself that it was just some late-night wanderer. I quickened my pace, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up as I walked past the figure, but just as I was about to leave the park behind, I heard something. A faint sound, like footsteps following me, but slow, deliberate, almost like they were waiting for me to notice. My pulse quickened, and I turned around. The figure was still standing under the tree, their heads slightly tilted as if watching me. I couldn't tell for sure, but it felt like their gaze was fixed on me. My mind raced. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light, but the sound of footsteps grew louder. I stopped walking again, my breath shallow as I turned around once more. There was no one there. The path was empty, just the trees and the shadows stretching across the pavement. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The hairs on my neck prickled as the air seemed to grow colder. It was as if the temperature had dropped in an instant, and the silence around me felt suffocating. I glanced at the figure one last time before starting to walk again, this time faster, with my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to get out of the park and back to the safety of the streetlights, away from whatever or whoever was out there. I barely made it to the edge of the park when I heard the footsteps again. They were closer, this time, just behind me, getting louder and faster, like someone was matching my pace. I couldn't ignore it anymore. My instincts screamed at me to run. I turned around, my breath ragged, ready to face whoever was following me. But once again, there was nothing. No one, just the empty path and the dark shadows of the trees. I stood there, frozen, my mind struggling to process what was happening. I was alone, but the footsteps, those unmistakable, deliberate steps, were still there. I could feel them, like someone was right behind me. My stomach turned, my skin crawling as I realized I wasn't imagining it. Someone, or something, was following me. I began to walk faster, then broke into a jog. The footsteps kept pace with me, no matter how fast I went. My breath came in ragged gasps as I looked around frantically, but there was no one there. The park seemed endless now, the trees closing in, the shadows growing darker. My heart was pounding in my chest, my thoughts racing. Why was no one else around? Why was it so quiet? I glanced over my shoulder again, and for a brief moment I saw something, just a flash of movement, a shadow darting between the trees. It was quick, too quick to make out, but it was there. My stomach lurched, and I sprinted toward the exit, not looking back. The footsteps, though, were relentless. They were right there, too close now, as if they were following every step I took. I could hear them clearly, as if the person was just behind me, waiting to catch up. I reached the park gate, nearly tripping over my own feet in my desperation to get out. I pulled on the metal bars, feeling the cold steel against my palms, but it was locked. Panic surged through me. The footsteps were almost deafening now, and I could feel the presence behind me, like someone was about to reach out and grab me. My breath hitched in my throat as I looked around, but the street was empty, the buildings around me silent. I was trapped. I stepped back from the gate, my mind racing. I had to get out of there. I had to get away from whatever was following me. In the distance, I saw the faint glow of a streetlight at the end of the park's path. It was only a few hundred yards, but it felt like miles. I had no choice. I turned and ran. I sprinted down the path, the footsteps growing louder and faster, matching my pace once again. They were too close now. I could feel the coldness, the chill in the air that seemed to press down on me. The shadows were everywhere, and for a moment I was sure I saw something moving in the corner of my vision. My legs burned, my heart was a drum in my chest, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Finally, I reached the streetlight. I stumbled onto the sidewalk, gasping for breath, my eyes wild. I glanced around, and this time I didn't see anyone. The footsteps had stopped. The air felt still again, like everything was waiting for something to happen. I didn't know what to do. I was shaking, my chest heaving as I tried to calm myself down. But that's when I heard it, a whisper, soft and faint but unmistakable. My name, Sarah. It was just behind me. The voice was so close I could feel it on my skin. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I turned and ran, faster than I ever had, not stopping until I reached my apartment building. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, my hands trembling. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every sound, every shift in the air made me jump, and the image of that figure standing motionless in the park kept haunting me. I didn't tell anyone what happened, not because I didn't want to, but because I wasn't sure I could explain it. I didn't know if anyone would believe me. I still don't. But sometimes when I'm out walking late at night, I hear the faintest echo of footsteps behind me. I turn around, but there's never anyone there, just the empty street, the empty park, and the silence. And I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone.
Story number 18.
I was never one to be easily spooked. Growing up in a small, quiet town, I'd always felt safe walking alone at night. The streets were quiet, the town was peaceful, and there was always something comforting about the rhythmic sound of my footsteps echoing in the silence. I worked late at a local diner, and after my shift, I'd often take a walk home, a few blocks away from the heart of town, just to clear my head and unwind. It was around 11:30 p.m. when I finished my shift that night. The cool fall air was crisp against my skin as I stepped outside, the only sounds being the faint rustling of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. The streetlights flickered softly, casting long shadows on the sidewalks. I pulled my jacket tighter around my body, the chill creeping under the fabric. It was a usual night, or so I thought. I started down the familiar street toward my apartment, passing by the row of houses and small businesses that lined the road. There was something oddly still about the town that evening. The wind had died down, and it felt as though the world was holding its breath. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the late hour, making everything seem quiet. As I walked, I noticed a figure at the end of the street near the old park. The park was always empty at night, so it was strange to see someone standing there, especially at such a late hour. The figure was just standing still, facing the park, with their back to me. They were wearing a long coat, but I couldn't make out any other details, not even the color. I quickened my pace, wondering if I should cross the street or maybe just turn around and take a longer route. But something about the figure felt off. It wasn't just that they were standing there in the dark. There was an unsettling stillness about them, like they were waiting for something, or someone. I tried not to think about it and continued walking, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger as I neared the intersection where I would turn toward my apartment. I glanced over at the figure again. They hadn't moved, but I couldn't help feeling like their presence was somehow unnatural. I had this strange sensation that they were watching me, though their head remained fixed in the direction of the park. A few more steps and I crossed the intersection, turning onto the next street. But just as I thought I was past it, I heard something. A sound. A sound. Footsteps. I froze. I listened. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. They seemed to be matching my pace, falling in line with my own steps. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't just the sound of footsteps, it was the rhythm of them. They were too perfectly timed, like someone was deliberately following me. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. Instead, I picked up my pace, walking faster, the sound of my footsteps now blending with the ones that seemed to trail behind me. It was all in my head, I told myself. I was just paranoid. But the fear kept growing, gnawing at me. I reached the next block, a short street that led directly to my apartment. I could see the outline of the building up ahead, the windows glowing faintly from the lights inside. I turned my head, just for a second, to see if anyone was behind me. There was no one. Relieved, I continued walking, though my heart still raced in my chest. The last thing I wanted was to feel foolish for letting my imagination run wild. But when I turned to look ahead, I froze again. The figure was standing at the end of the block, directly in front of my building. They hadn't been there before. It was impossible for them to have gotten there that fast without me noticing, especially when I had just looked back a few moments ago and seen nothing. I stopped, staring at the figure. They were standing still again, facing the building, but there was something different now. They seemed closer, much closer than before. The only thing that was the same was that they hadn't moved. But I could feel them, feel their presence, like something in the air had shifted. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, washed over me. I didn't think. I turned and started running. My heart was pounding, my breath short, my mind racing. I didn't care if I looked crazy. I just needed to get home. I reached my building in seconds, slamming the door behind me, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my keys. Once I was inside, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to steady my breath. But the feeling of dread didn't go away. It lingered, clinging to me like a shadow. I spent the next few hours pacing around my apartment, trying to calm myself, but I couldn't shake the image of the figure standing in the street. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that I finally managed to get some sleep, but it was fitful and plagued with nightmares. The next day, I told myself it was just an overreaction. I hadn't slept well the night before, and my mind had simply played tricks on me. But the memory of the figure, of the footsteps, haunted me all day. The thought of walking alone at night again was enough to make my skin crawl. But eventually, I had to admit to myself that I couldn't let fear control me. That evening, I worked a late shift again. When my shift ended, I stood outside the diner, staring down the street. The night air was cold, and I had no choice but to walk home. I told myself it would be different this time. I wouldn't be scared. I made my way down the same street, the same path I always took, determined to prove to myself that I wasn't going to let whatever had happened the previous night haunt me. But as I walked, the feeling of unease crept back. It was as though the very air had thickened, pressing against me from all sides. I tried to shake it off, but it was impossible. Then, as I turned the corner, I saw it again. The figure. Standing at the end of the street, just as it had been the night before. I froze. My stomach dropped. This time I didn't turn to run. I didn't have to. Because before I could even move, the figure started to walk toward me. It was slow, deliberate, like the night itself was shifting with each step it took. My heart pounded as the figure drew closer, and I felt that same primal fear in the pit of my stomach. I reached the intersection, my apartment just beyond it, but I couldn't go back. Not with that figure following me, getting closer with every second. I had to do something. I took a deep breath and started walking faster. My feet were heavy, the fear weighing me down, but I pushed forward, willing myself not to look behind me. I reached the end of the block, and when I glanced over my shoulder, there was no one there. Just the empty street, as it had always been. I rushed home that night, locking the door behind me, and for the first time I knew I couldn't walk alone at night again. Not in that town, not with that figure lurking somewhere in the darkness. I never saw the figure again, but I'll never forget the feeling of its presence, the way it followed me, waiting. Even now, when I walk down those streets, I swear I can feel its eyes on me, watching from the shadows. Story the end.
Story number 19.
I had always been one to enjoy solitary walks. There was something soothing about the quiet of the night, the empty streets, and the gentle breeze that seemed to carry away the weight of the day. It wasn't until one particular evening that my peaceful routine turned into something far more unsettling than I could have imagined. It was just after midnight, and I had finished up a late-night study session at the library. My apartment was only a 15-minute walk from the university, and I often found the solitude of the walk to be a comforting transition between the day's work and the quiet of my room. The campus was mostly deserted at this hour, the only sounds being the occasional rustle of wind through the trees or the distant hum of traffic. That night, the air was colder than usual, and a thick fog had begun to settle over the streets, making the streetlights flicker as if they, too, were uncertain of the darkness. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and began the walk back home, taking the familiar route that cut through an old residential area. The road was lined with tall, skeletal trees, their branches bare and swaying eerily in the wind. The fog was dense, making it difficult to see much more than a few feet ahead. It wasn't long before I began to feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me, like the night itself was holding its breath. I quickened my pace, eager to reach the more populated area of the street ahead. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't a fear I could put into words, just a vague, creeping discomfort that seemed to grow with each step. And then I heard it, a soft shuffle behind me. It was faint at first, almost like the sound of footsteps dragging through the wet pavement. I told myself it was just my imagination, that maybe it was the wind or the creaking of the trees. But then the sound came again, closer this time, unmistakable. Footsteps. I turned quickly, my heart leaping into my throat, but there was no one in sight. The street was still, the fog thick, and the only movement was the rustling of leaves. I stood there for a moment, trying to shake off the unease. Perhaps someone else was walking at the same time, and I hadn't noticed them. I took a deep breath and turned to continue walking, my pace slightly quicker now. The sound of footsteps resumed, but this time they were much clearer, much more deliberate. Someone was walking behind me. I could feel my pulse racing as I sped up. My mind raced. Was it just someone else walking home, or was there something else? The footsteps were unnervingly close now, so close that I could almost feel the presence of another person, just out of sight. I glanced behind me again, and once more, there was no one. No one at all. Just the fog, the street, the trees. But the footsteps didn't stop. They continued, slowly but steadily, keeping pace with me. I felt a surge of panic, my chest tightening, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The footsteps were too consistent, too deliberate to be a coincidence. They were following me. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get away, to find safety. But I didn't know where to go. There was nowhere on the street I could duck into for shelter. I was in the middle of a quiet residential area with few houses that seemed lived in, and the streetlights offered little comfort. I forced myself to keep walking, but my steps were faster now, my body moving almost mechanically as I tried to push away the growing dread in my gut. I could feel the presence, the footsteps behind me, just beyond the edge of my vision, taunting me with their proximity. I rounded a corner, hoping to lose whoever or whatever was following me. But when I looked again, the footsteps were still there. Not louder, not quieter, just there. Always behind me. Never speeding up, never slowing down. At this point, I was almost running, my feet pounding against the pavement, my eyes darting over my shoulder every few seconds. But it didn't matter how fast I moved, the footsteps remained right there. Close enough that if I turned around, I'd expect to see someone, but when I did, the street was always empty. I was just about to cross a small bridge when I felt something cold brush against my cheek. It was a subtle touch, like the faintest gust of wind, but it made my hair stand on end. The footsteps stopped. For a split second, I felt a wave of relief, thinking I had finally outrun whatever had been behind me. But then I heard a voice. It was soft at first, barely a whisper, but it came from directly behind me. The voice spoke my name, Jenna. My blood ran cold. I knew that voice. I froze in place, the sound of my name hanging in the air like an echo. The voice wasn't a stranger's, it was my mother's. She had passed away 2 years ago after a long battle with illness. I hadn't heard her voice in so long, yet here it was, unmistakable, calling me from the fog. Jenna. I turned slowly, my heart in my throat. There was no one there, not even a figure in the mist, just empty streets and shadows. But then the voice came again, closer this time, like she was standing right next to me, whispering in my ear, Jenna, come closer. I felt my legs go weak, my body trembling with fear as I stumbled backward. I couldn't process what was happening. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. The voice, her voice, had no right to be here. Not now, not in the dead of night, not in this place. I stumbled backward again, turning around to run, but my body was moving on its own. The footsteps, the voice, it all blurred together in a haze of terror. When I finally reached my apartment, I didn't stop to look around. I ran straight inside, locked the door, and bolted every window. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, staring out into the dark, trying to make sense of what had happened. The voice was still ringing in my ears, faint but persistent. I never walked home that late again. I never walked that route again. I didn't know what it was that had followed me that night, whether it was my grief playing tricks on my mind or something far more sinister, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever it had been real, and it had been watching me the whole time. Story the end.
Story number 20.
I had always liked the peace that came with walking alone at night. There was something about the quiet, the soft hum of distant traffic, the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant flicker of streetlights that made the world feel smaller, calmer, and more intimate. Living in the city, I often found myself taking late-night walks to clear my head after a busy day. This particular night, I had just finished a late shift at the bookstore where I worked, and I decided to walk the long way home. The air was crisp, the streets mostly deserted. The solitude felt comforting. I lived in an older part of the city, with narrow streets and houses that looked as if they had stories to tell. The houses on my street were spaced far apart with large yards full of trees and hedges. The streetlights were dim, casting long shadows along the sidewalks. It was just past midnight when I left the bookstore. The only sounds I could hear were the soft tapping of my shoes against the pavement and the faint hum of the city in the distance. I wasn't in a hurry. I never was when I took these late-night walks. I liked to slow down, let the rhythm of the night surround me. The streets felt like they belonged to me, as if the world were asleep and I was the only one awake. But tonight was different. As I walked down one of the quieter streets, I began to notice a strange feeling creeping over me. It was subtle at first, just a slight discomfort that I couldn't explain. My senses seemed heightened, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once. It was as if something wasn't right, though I couldn't pinpoint what it was. I pushed the feeling aside, convincing myself it was just the lingering fatigue from a long day at work. But as I neared the park at the end of the block, the unease grew stronger. The streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows along the sidewalk. The trees in the park stood like dark sentinels, their bare branches swaying gently in the wind. I told myself it was nothing, just nerves. There was no reason to feel afraid. But then I heard it. At first, it was barely audible, just a soft shuffle of feet behind me. I paused, looking around. There was no one. The street was empty, just me and the sound of the wind. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as nothing. But as I resumed walking, I heard the footsteps again. This time louder, closer. I stopped once more, my heart starting to race. I glanced over my shoulder, but the street behind me was still empty. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I stood frozen, trying to make sense of what was happening. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was probably someone else out for a late walk. But the feeling in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. I quickened my pace, hoping to get to the next block faster. The footsteps, however, did not stop. They were still there, just behind me, matching my stride. My pulse quickened as I glanced around again. Nothing. No one. I broke into a light jog, the sound of my own footsteps mingling with the ones following me. I turned the corner, desperate to reach the next intersection where the lights were brighter, but the footsteps were still there, following my every move. My heart was pounding in my chest now, and I could feel my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I was just overreacting, but the rational part of my mind was losing the battle. There was someone behind me. I could feel it, could hear it. It wasn't a trick of the wind or my imagination. The footsteps were real. I picked up the pace even more, my legs aching, the sound of my breathing mingling with the footsteps behind me. I dared not turn around again, afraid of what I might see. The streetlights seemed to stretch further and further away, and the shadows around me grew darker, more oppressive. As I reached the next intersection, I finally turned down a different street, hoping the change in direction would help, but the footsteps followed. Closer now, louder. almost as if whoever was behind me was right on my heels. My throat went dry, and I could feel panic rising in my chest. I took a sharp left onto a smaller, dimly lit alley, hoping to lose whoever, or whatever, was following me. But no matter where I went, the footsteps never stopped. It was as if they were everywhere, all around me. I could almost hear them in my ears now, slow and deliberate, like someone was waiting for me to acknowledge their presence. The alley was narrow, the buildings on either side casting long shadows. I could feel the cold air closing in, suffocating me. I was sure now that I wasn't imagining things. Someone or something was following me. I turned around, my heart hammering in my chest. And there, standing at the end of the alley, was a figure. It was difficult to make out the details, but it was tall, unnaturally tall. Its outline was blurred, as if the shadows themselves were clinging to it, distorting its shape. I couldn't see its face, only the dark silhouette of its body standing motionless in the gloom. My blood ran cold. I turned to run, but my legs felt like lead. Every instinct in me screamed to get away, but the alley seemed to stretch on forever. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence. It was there, watching me. I managed to tear my gaze away and started running again, my feet stumbling over the uneven ground. The footsteps still behind me kept pace as if they were chasing me. I didn't dare look back. When I reached the main street, I broke free from the alley and ran straight into the first lit area I could find. I collapsed onto a bench, gasping for air, my heart racing. The footsteps had stopped. I looked around frantically, but no one was there. The street was empty, silent. I sat there for a long time, trying to calm myself down. But the strange sensation of being watched never left me. I stayed on that bench for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something, anything to change. But nothing did. Finally, I stood up, my legs shaking. I didn't want to walk back the way I had come, but I had no other choice. I turned onto the main road, walking quickly, my eyes scanning the darkness around me. The silence was suffocating. As I walked, I realized that I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, behind me, just out of sight, following me. When I finally reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me and bolted every window. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure standing at the end of the alley, its presence hanging over me like a dark cloud. I never walked alone at night again after that. And every time I step out of my apartment, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching, waiting, and the sound of footsteps always just behind me never quite fades.